Well, a week from today, the presidential election campaign will become history. Who will win? Everybody wants to know, but nobody knows. During the last week, Bush has begun to lose some ground. Whether he will lose enough to lose the election, it's really impossible to say at this point. I think quail is increasingly becoming a heavier weight on Bush's neck. People are getting more worried that quail may become the president, and as president, he would be the commander-in-chief and have his finger on the nuclear button. And I think that frightens people tremendously. The issue that has been covered up in the campaign are the economic questions. And they are the most explosive ones today. Most are aware that the economic time bomb is ticking. Most economists do not want to be labeled as the carriers of the message of economic doom and gloom. And Reagan adds to their fear with these charges that if the economists predict an economic crisis, the economy will collapse. And therefore they're very careful not to make such predictions. At the risk of being called a messenger of doom and gloom, I will go on the limb and say that the artificially maintained illusion of well-being is coming to an end. The illusion, the dream, is turning into a nightmare very shortly. There are both short-range and long-range reasons for the economic malaise. Most Americans, as we know, have had experience with planned obsolescence, where corporations program into a product the date when it falls apart. As a rule, the product falls apart right after the warranty runs out, within days. The Reagan administration has programmed into the economy some short-term planned obsolescence that will run out after November 8th. The Federal Reserve Board has manipulated the money supply to hold down interest rates on the short run. The Pentagon has signed $150 billion worth of contracts with the election day in mind, and they're in the pipeline, most of them. Some corporations have postponed layoffs till after election day, and some corporations like A&P have given election day $5 bonus checks with an idea of promoting Bush. As one government banking regulator said, and I quote, "Everybody has their fingers crossed, hoping to make it through this minefield and get to November." End of the quotation. Then there is the advice of another Bush-supporting economist, and I quote, "Like Reagan did, make your adjustment early. Take your economic recession early. Take your recession early in your term and be in the recovery mode in time for your own re-election campaign." End of quotation. And if we recall, that's exactly what Reagan did, and we had the economic crisis in the first years of the Reagan administration. Another Bush advisor states, quote, "The rate of unemployment is too low." And then he continues, 7% or higher is a natural and a desirable check on wages and inflation. Less than 7% would have a destabilizing effect on the economy. End of quotation. The long-term developments that are now moving close to the economic brink are also interesting. The close to $3 trillion federal government debt that grows at the rate of approximately $200 billion a year. It is borrowing money on which the government pays $150 billion on interest, or 15% of the budget each year. It also keeps growing every year. Then there is the $150 billion annual trade deficit. Most of this goes to the multinational corporations who have it coming and going, both from exporting and importing of products. Then, of course, there is the military hog that squander over $300 billion a year and up, of which my estimate is that 60% of that is pure corruption, skimmed from the top by the military-industrial corporations. But all these policies are now coming home to roost. For the people, of course, it means downward mobility. For the very rich, it means upward mobility. The Reagan-Bush team has doubled the number of multimillionaires and billionaires. They've doubled the number of billionaires. For the people, it has resulted in, of course, 4 to 5 million homeless, 60 million living below the poverty level, 40 million without any kind of health insurance, a 15% reduction in real wages, and of course the economic effects of racism has resulted in a widening of the wage gap in an increasing percentage, and in an increasing percentage of the unemployed and homeless being Afro-American Latinos. Well, it may sound like gloom and doom, but the reality is that we are now headed for an end to the artificially stimulated Reagan voodoo economics. The borrowing binge has become counterproductive. The hot chicks are coming home to roost. I like that phrase, but it's hard to pronounce. The hot chicks. As we know, the Benson in his debate talked about the $200 billion hot checks that the Reagan administration is using. The more class-conscious section of monopoly capital sees the handwriting on the wall, the Wall Street wall. There are now dozens of corporation-supported think tanks who have turned their focus to long-range economic damage control. They know the Reagan, economics is headed for the supply side economics is headed for a downside. And it's going to be a serious economic problem shortly. They operate like a covert secret network, these think tanks. And in the center is what is called the National Economic Commission that was set up by Congress. And interesting enough, it was set up by the initiative of Democratic members of Congress. It is a bipartisan commission, and that should alarm anybody immediately. It is made up of leading Democrats and Republicans, plus corporate heads, people like Iacocca, Casper Weinberger, Lane Kirkland, and Moynihan, amongst others, are on this National Economic Commission. Their aim is to come up with solutions to the long-term economic landmines planted by the Reagan administration. It will be no surprise that the labels on the landmines will read like a list of who's who in corporate America. The question is, why are these think tanks secret from the people? And they're covert operations all the way through, including this economic commission set up by a Congress. Mainly because their thoughts and their proposed solutions are all anti-people and pro-corporate. That's the basic nature of all their proposals. Of course, like this commission, the real proposals will come up, and they say it's secret until the elections. They will make the proposals after the elections are over. What is the nature of the solutions the think tanks are coming up with? And I would say again that whenever Republicans and Democrats agree to work together based on past experience, the results will be a swindle against the people. You recall that was the case with the Social Security question a few years ago. It was a bipartisan commission that made the proposals to cut for 6 months the Social Security payment. Because when it's bipartisan, neither party has to take the blame. And that's why they set up these bipartisan committees. And the Commission is coming up with what they call, quote, austerity economics. It's a new phrase that they have come up with, austerity economics. And of course it means austerity for the people. The idea is to impose the cost of, quote, economic revival, end of quote, on the backs of workers and the poor. And they speak about the purpose of the Commission for Economic Revival. They all contain ideas of tax increases on the people and new tax cuts for the rich and the corporations. Every one of these think tanks move in that direction. And of course we know Bush advocates already a $10 billion tax cut by way of the capital gains tax. He proposes opening other loopholes for the rich, but that's his main proposal, is the $10 billion tax cut for the rich. And of course not a single think tank proposes a cut in the military budget. Not a single one of them. They play around with it, but none of them are moving in that direction. All the proposed cuts are in what is called, the, quote, the entitlement programs, which of course means Social Security, Medicare, child care, food stamps, education, housing, and so on. What now adds to the economic mess that is, coming after the elections is the wild buyout takeover binge that is going on in the country. And it is a binge. The big mega corporations are buying up other mega corporations. This week, 2 deals are worth $32 billion. Not million, but $32 billion. And so far this year, these takeovers add up to $366 billion. I mean, that's going more than almost a budget and so on. These billion-dollar deals are being financed by mega banks and workers' pension funds, and that's the real danger, that the workers' pension funds are just being shoveled into these deals. When Trump, for instance, bought out Eastern Shuttle, he did not use his own money. So in a sense, the banks bought Eastern through Trump. He borrowed most of the money. Through these buyouts, the corporations add billions to their debts, and that's the new thing. The corporate debts are really sky high, and the banks add billions to their outstanding loans. And of course, everybody's now talking about the fact that the banks did this with third world countries, made big loans and got stuck. Later made them with, in agriculture and got stuck. And now, of course, there is growing fear that they're making these loans to buyouts and they're going to get stuck, but this time with much bigger sums. Because the corporations add billions to their interest payments on these debts. A $20 billion deal adds $600 million to the interest bank that does it. That's a big but of course it's the people who will in the end pay. These interest payments are tax deductible, and therefore they are eliminated from the taxes that corporations pay, and the budget keeps going up, so the people are the ones that will finally have to pay these deals. And of course for the workers, the net effect is more layoffs. The announcement this morning of Sears Roebuck, reorganization and buyout threats, and 8,000 workers most likely will be laid off as a result of that. There's a growing fear that with a decline in production, and the fear of a decline of production is real. This morning's, the production report already went down some, and unemployment went up, which I think all indicates that there are movements in this direction. And of course the fear is that any decline in production is that this sector of the economy will be the first to blow up, and I think their fears are well-founded. Most of the voters know that neither Bush nor Dukakis have dealt with these basic economic questions that are in front of the country. Bush has not, because the think tanks are very much in line with the policies of the Reagan-Bush administration. In fact, they follow the administration line all the way. Dukakis hasn't, because some of his advisors from Harvard are also members of some of these think tanks, and therefore there's an influence there. So our conclusion is that whichever gets elected, there will be the need for new approaches to people's struggles. The new level of the crisis, and will call for a new level of unity, a new level of militancy, and everything else. So as I say, go on the limb that not too far from the elections, we will have this kind of an economic development. So much attention is being given to how the Soviet Union is dealing with their history, that the uproar that is going on in our country about how to teach history in our universities and colleges goes unnoticed largely. And this uproar is about books and concepts and history, and it's quite a development. There's an ultra-right attack led by Bennett, who was the Secretary of Education, and a Mr. Bloom and Sam Bellows, two authors, on this academic front. The three leading the right-wing attack are Bennett, Bloom, and Bellows, and therefore some professor called them the three killer bees, Bennett, Bloom, and Bellows. The killer bees want to burn books that in any way reflected the struggles of the 60s, especially the books that have been written by Afro-Americans or women. That's their main a target, that they must be eliminated in history studies and so on. They want to do in the field of literature what Mies wanted to do with the Constitution, while hiding behind the so-called original intent of the framers of the Constitution. The killer bees try to hide their reactionariness behind the so-called basic Western culture. They say the stress on class, race, and gender is too Marxist, too deterministic. That's their main objection to class, race, and gender. What they advocate is to eliminate anything that reflects the class struggle in literature, basically. Those who oppose the killer bees position of books of Western culture only state that they are books written by, quote, dead white European males. The Western books of Western culture. Of course, that's a nice phrase, but I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is more basic. I think the basic criterion for books should be how truthfully they depict history or events. Because the class struggle has been in the very center of history since the days of communal society, books that include classes and the class struggle are books that should be on the reading list of the classes in universities and colleges. It's clear that the books and the so-called Western culture that the Bennetts push are books in which the class side of the past societies are ignored. They carefully pick books that ignore the class struggle side of it. Of course, literature that only includes the class struggle is not good Marxism either, and we shouldn't argue it on that basis. Marxism sees the class struggle and the economic relationships as the main factor determining history, but not the only one. The question was put to Engels, and he said self-critically that economics was not the only factor, and that he and his friend Marx were so busy dealing with that central question of the class that they did not have time to deal enough with other human factors that influence history. The term Marxist economic determinism in itself false. Marx and Engels never saw economic relationships with history in such narrow and limited ways. One thing Marx, Engels, and Lenin were not is dogmatic, narrow, inflexible, or lifeless. They were as flexible and realistic as life itself. During my speaking trip to California last week, some progressive people privately asked me whether socialism as a system would disappear because of the uproar and turmoil and discussions that is going on. The question emerged in their thoughts because of the turmoil in some of the socialist countries. My answer was there is no such danger. Socialism has sunk deep roots. The upsurge is about making socialism work better, not to do away with it. Socialism worldwide is going through a very special period. It is a period of revitalization, of experimentation, of trial and error. Each of the socialist countries are doing it their own way, based on their own unique national experiences and characteristics. China is a most recent example of this experimentation. For the last few years, China has experimented with what is called a market economy. It experimented with a downgrading of centralized planning. It permitted the different provinces to do their own bidding, including for foreign factories and so on. But things got out of hand, including prices, wages, and production. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of China met last month and decided that some of the economic factors got out of hand. So they decided to give central planning a bigger role, including the right to make decisions on what foreign factories and so on. They established some guidelines on what priorities in production and some control over inflation and so on. They left the positive side of the trial and error in place. They corrected what they thought was a negative side of the experience of the last few years. The socialist countries are going to go through such a period. For example, they are going to draw conclusions that a socialist market economy without central planning and some control is not going to work. I'm sure that, China already has drawn that conclusion. Of course, we in the capitalist world know from our own experience that the so-called capitalist market-oriented economy does not work well either. And therefore, it's not an example for the socialist country. What about the longer-range outlook for socialism? In the economic area, the socialist countries go through many experiments. Not all of the experiments will be successful, but the overall result will be a new blueprint for a new level of building socialism. All the experiences will come together in these discussions and so on. Most of the socialist countries are taking steps towards democracy. The running of the state and party institutions are turned over to the people. In some cases, people who influenced by nationalism or people who are against socialism and people who have personal complaints join in the demonstrations. And that gives some of these demonstrations a different quality. Some of this is unavoidable, I think. The bottom line is that socialism is here to stay. There will be trial and error. There will be mistakes made. But socialism is the way of the future. Last week in my radio program in Los Angeles, Congressman Kemp said, quote, "If Gus Hall thinks socialism is the way of the future, he's crazy," end of quotation. Well, history will prove that socialism will be just another thing Kemp had made a mistake about and is wrong.